Good evening. My name is Claire Bishop, and I am the Executive Director at American Public Square at Jewell. I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's program, where we will be discussing the changing landscape of U.S. immigration law and policy. APS is pleased to partner with Donnelly College to engage our community in a thoughtful conversation about immigration issues this evening. I want to thank each of you for being here for this important conversation. American Public Square is committed to our mission of improving the tone and quality of public discourse by helping our community meaningfully address society's most pressing issues. For this evening's program, we are also pleased to be partnering with the Kansas City Public Library's Refugee and Immigrant Services Empowerment Program, whose mission it is to connect immigrant populations with quality services, resources, and lifelong learning opportunities. Evan Wasachek, Information Services Supervisor for the Kansas City Public Library, is the author of the fact sheet for tonight's program. You can access the fact sheet on our website at www.americanpublicsquare.org. Special appreciation goes out this evening to our presenting sponsors, the City of Kansas City, Missouri, the Hall Family Foundation, the H&R Block Foundation, Sue Seidler and Louis Nerman, PlexPod, and William Jewell College. Tonight's program is also generously supported by Casey Common Good. This evening, APS staffer Allison Kelzer will serve as your roving reporter for our program. And Chris LeBeau, who's a familiar face to many at APS, will serve as our fact checker tonight. As always, during American Public Square programs, we welcome questions from the audience. Our roving reporter will be watching for questions that you may have for our panel. Please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom. You can also use the Q&A section of Zoom to request a fact check. We ask simply that when you request a fact check, you specify as a fact check and not a question when you submit your comments. If you're watching on Facebook, you may also ask your questions and request a fact check by posting in the comments section. We'll be looking out for those, and we hope that as our audience, you'll engage with the extraordinary panel that we have put together for this evening. It is now my privilege to introduce tonight's panel moderator, Msgr. Stuart Swetland, President of Donnelly College. Msgr, I now hand the virtual mic over to you.
Thank you, Claire. It's such a good evening to be with you on this beautiful evening here in Kansas City. I appreciate all of you joining us tonight. As your moderator, my intent is to engage in a balanced dialogue with our panelists. With that, let me welcome tonight's panelists. Our first panelist is Manuel Abarca. Manuel is the Deputy District Director for Congressman Emanuel Cleaver's office. Welcome, Manuel. Next, we have Dr. Mona Line, who is an Associate Professor and former chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, UMKC. Welcome, Dr. Line. Our third panelist is Ken Oliver. Ken is Senior Director of Engagement and Right on Immigration at the Center of the landmark Texas Public Policy Foundation. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you.
And last but not least, we have Jessica Piedra. Jessica is an attorney with more than 15 years of experience in assisting immigrants in their legal journey. Welcome to each of you. I want to jump right in with questions, but before I do, I must say we originally planned to do this, like many things in our society, at a different time. We tended to do this in the spring when we would have been further away from the election and everything political. But because of COVID-19 and other concerns, this was delayed like many things. So we're here on American Public Square and at Donnelly College, we're very aware that we have to resituate sometimes. So having resituated this discussion, I think we have to address the political issues right at the beginning. So I'm going to ask two of our panelists to summarize as best they can for us where the two political parties stand in their party platforms on the question of immigration. So since the Republican Party has the executive branch right now, I'm going to go to Ken Oliver to speak of what the Republican platform has to say about immigration. Ken?
Thank you, Monsignor. It's great to be with my fellow panelists and everyone on tonight. As you know, because of the pandemic, the Republican Party, or maybe some don't know, but the Republican Party did not do a new platform for this year. It simply restated its commitment to the 2016 platform. But on immigration, it did say that President Trump, if he is reelected, has certain priorities. He has also announced in May of last year an immigration plan. We have yet to see a bill in Congress, but we know that Jared Kushner has been working with senators on a bill that we have yet to see introduced. However, I will say that the president did say that among his priorities in the second term, and of course, we've seen a lot of action on immigration these last few years, that certainly if there's one issue where he had a mandate on, a legitimate mandate, in my view, from the American people, it was what he promised to do on immigration. He certainly distinguished himself on that issue to be elected president. And that is very much focused on border security, on the barrier, the secure fence turned into the wall, but certainly fighting criminal alien elements within the population, prioritizing the removal of MS-13 gangs. That's one of his also commitments for the second term, to focus on automatic deportation for gang members, to dismantle the human trafficking networks, to end sanctuary cities. And there's two other items: block illegal immigrants from receiving public benefits such as healthcare, which we know there's a difference between the parties on, and also prohibiting American companies in this very severe economic crisis, perhaps the greatest since the Great Depression that we've had, prohibiting companies from hiring or undercutting American workers as we begin to restart legal immigration, which has, of course, been on a pause, a temporary pause by the president because of the pandemic.
Thank you, Ken, for that summary. Manuel, I know you work for a congressman, but you're speaking here as an independent citizen. Your analysis of the Democratic Party platform for 2020.
Thank you, Monsignor. I had the privilege of serving as a national delegate for the Joe Biden campaign. So I had a chance to dig in a little bit deeper from that role and actually reviewed the 23-page document from the Joe Biden and Harris website specific to immigration, where they dug very deep in the policy concerns and issues facing many of our immigrants and undocumented folks throughout the country. As opposed to a piecemealed effort to accomplish political points, you see that they're directly addressing very serious policy issues, focused primarily on the humanitarian side of immigration, migration, refugee and asylum seeker positioning. And so when it comes to policy specifically, I've got a nice 3 tabs here, but I'll just kind of hit some of the highlights. Definitely refocusing on DACA and DAPA programs. This was an initiative of the Obama-Biden administration to begin with, due to the inaction of the then Republican-led House of Representatives after a failed effort from the Senate side. Wanted to also mention an end of the family separation policy, end to prolonged detention and reinvestment in case management efforts, the reverse of the public charge changes that were recently announced earlier this year, the recommitting to ensuring the pathway to citizenship for our individuals who serve in the military, who may be immigrants, refocus on the TPS programs and deferred enforcement departure programs that allow for folks to maintain that family security set up while they're in the process of immigrating legally. A renewed focus on the infrastructure of legal immigration systems, ensuring that the resources are provided for the immigration system in whole, so that you don't have these extended and long wait times as you're processing through that program. Refocusing on the reality that there's $23.6 billion collected from the IRS from 4.4 million workers that are contributing to the Social Security program, but not receiving any of those benefits, and really truly acknowledging that we have a much broader issue here that only comprehensive immigration reform can truly deal with. So we have a very progressive platform when it comes to the Democratic side that is very focused and is not a retread issue.
Thank you. I think it's probably appropriate now that we put this in historical context. So I'm going to ask Dr. Line, if you would tell us, how do we get here basically as in immigration, especially over the last biblical generation is 20 years, but if you want to go back 40, that's your call as a professor. How do we get here, and how does current enforcement differ perhaps, or the current administration's approach differ from what we've seen before? So situate us historically.
Well, thank you, Monsignor. It's great to be a part of this conversation tonight about immigration. I'm going to try to give a very brief background here. So the last comprehensive reform was in 1986. So quite a long time ago. And this legislation did a number of things, but probably most important for our conversation tonight, it introduced a lot of new border control measures, but it also provided a path to citizenship for undocumented folks. And these two provisions together, it was hoped, would both bring the undocumented folks out of the shadows and into full citizenship, but also stem the tide of continued border crossings. This did not happen, and border crossings continue to the point that today we have, it's estimated 11 to 12 million undocumented folks. And basically every administration since the reform has tried to address this problem and basically has seen this problem as, or addressing this problem in some way as necessary to a new comprehensive reform. And I should mention that the current problem of undocumented folks, it's partly border crossings, but it's now equally a problem of visa overstays. So folks that get a tourist visa or some other kind of temporary visa, but then stay beyond their allotted time. So every administration since 1986 has tried a range of measures to deal with strengthening border control, dealing with illegal entry. So more money, more personnel, administrative reforms, new institutions, technological upgrades, tightening procedures for various aspects, deportation, tightening procedures for immediate deportation, tightening procedures for detention until a hearing can be had, tightening procedures for asylum claims. And again, I would argue this was true of Clinton, of Bush, of Obama. All were putting in new measures. But again, I think, and particularly in the case of Obama, well, I should say really in the case of Bush as well, because he actually got some legislation to Congress, but all of them in an attempt to lay the foundation for a new comprehensive reform and a new program to bring undocumented folks out of the shadows. And I just want to mention three kinds of issues that really have bedeviled every attempt at reform. So one is to balance securing the border with business needs for workers. Here, primarily, we're talking about in agriculture. That's the first. The second, reform of the legal immigration system to balance fairness with economic need. And here, what is really under the concern is family reunifications, but then also skilled immigrants or admitting immigrants, skilled immigrants that are needed in the American economy. So balancing those two. And in fact, the US is the only advanced economy that still largely emphasizes family reunification over admitting people with skills that are needed. And then, of course, the perennial problem of addressing the now very large undocumented population. Basically, again, every administration has tried to kind of balance out these competing needs and demands. None has succeeded. But I would say, and then just moving into how things have changed under Trump, all of these previous administrations really looked at immigration in the sense of the United States needs and wants immigrants, but needs a fair and balanced policy. The Trump administration has really been a major departure from this. It's, largely opposed to immigration, or has been very focused on restricting dealing with the border, but also restricting legal immigration. So he's very aggressively used executive orders and administrative procedures. Some of this is well known, of course, the wall, the family separations in terms of dealing with illegal entry. He has very aggressively stepped up deportation of undocumented folks. So previous administrations typically focused on people who had some kind of legal issue or other issue in their background, but did not go after long-standing folks who had been here for a long time, had no issues. The Trump administration has basically gone after all undocumented immigrants. He has spoken out against family reunification. People may be familiar with this when he talks about chain migration. That's something he opposes as well, but it's known as family reunification. He's dramatically tightened rules around asylum, all of the things that other administrations have tried to deal with, but that he has even tightened even much more dramatically. So rules around asylum, rules around immediate deportation or the rights to a hearing, and so on. Finally, the number of refugees in the last 2 years is the lowest the United States has had since we started an official refugee policy in 1980. And then lastly, of course, with COVID, he has used various health threats and various laws to really almost completely stop all immigration. Asylum claims are essentially impossible now, dramatically reduced work visas, and so on. So that's a very, very quick summary.
Mona, glaring by the absence and talking about administrations, you didn't talk about Congress, where immigration law is really supposed to be written, but we'll get back to that. It says something in itself. I want to bring Jessica in here to talk about the local effects of all this, especially what affects economic and social for the greater Kansas City region. That what we just heard is causing, especially for DACA, but you can go beyond that to any of the, what would it look like if that program ended, like might happen? Plus, I would even ask, is mass deportation, but is it even possible, or what would that look like?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your great summary there. A little bit of what is happening now, I think, and bringing in that's a great overview. But to remember that immigration is a policy that affects our entire nation, but it also affects the individuals, that are impacted directly, like the U.S. citizen family members of these undocumented immigrants, or even documented immigrants that it's been made impossible for them to stay in status. And so there's real consequences to not only the 11 million undocumented folks that we have here, which it's actually net zero of folks that are coming in without status. Like Dr. Lynn mentioned, that more folks are leaving than coming in without papers. Most of the folks that we have coming in at this point are either coming in to legitimately seek asylum, as is allowed under international law and under our laws, or are coming in with some sort of temporary visa and are overstaying. I'd really like to, we have a short time tonight, and I'm honored to be here with all of you. But I want to put a shout out to the Netflix film, Immigration Nation, because I deal with this all day, every day. And it was just really amazing to hear from the mouths of the ICE agents about how things have shifted. There's really not a political agenda to that show either. I mean, they just followed people around and showed how they are widely increasing, where they're just ripping people out of their homes. They come and bang on the door at 5 a.m. And in previous administrations, if they were looking for someone who maybe had been previously deported and had re-entered, they would take that one person. But now what we've seen is the shift of they'll speak to everyone else in the room and maybe take 20 people with them as collateral damage. And so an entire community is impacted in that way. We've seen a return. I've actually been doing this for about 20 years. I guess I need to update my bio. So I started right in the Bush administration. So I've seen several presidents, and started right before the attacks on 9/11, and saw the shifts in policy there, where we're seeing sort of a throwback to the Bush era of these large raids that really impact communities. I mean, we saw in Mississippi that 600 people were detained in one day, and where there were, several hundred children that didn't have anywhere to go after school, and the school had to step up and feed them. This is not an America I want to return to. I think we really need to think about it as community members and citizens. If this is what we want our tax dollars going towards, is really deporting parents away from their U.S. citizen children. I think we're long overdue to there's some really common sense fixes like DACA, and then I'll wrap up my little portion here and we'll talk about that. DACA was actually a Band-Aid that immigrant youth forced Obama to enact, and I'm grateful, but they made that happen with community organizing. It didn't come from politicians. It came from the 2 million undocumented youth that didn't have any options after Congress failed to pass the DREAM Act that would have provided them with permanent status with a green card in 2010. And so we're now at the 20th anniversary of that, or next year, hopefully, that the DREAM Act has been pending in the Congress. And it's been time and time again blocked by anti-immigrant Congress members. Most specifically, I think Manny mentioned the 2013 bill, where the votes were there, but the Republican leadership of the Senate at that time would not allow it to come to the floor, much like this will be my last point, much like the Dream and Promise Act of 2019, which passed the House of Representatives, which would have provided a path to permanent residence, both for immigrant youth and for TPS holders. So that's about 3 million folks who have lived legally in our communities, for more than a decade.
Thank you. I'm going to check in with Allison and Chris. Is there any facts checks or roving reporting questions that we need to get to?
Thank you, Monsignor. Yes, I want to remind the audience, those watching on Facebook and those watching through Zoom webinar, that they could submit their questions through the Q&A feature. We haven't had too many. We do have one fact check in there that I'm sure Chris is working on. After my question here, Monsignor, if you want to ask Chris, I'm sure she will be ready to respond. I do have a question available for our panelist, Ken Oliver, as he's been able to speak more specifically on the Trump administration. So the Trump administration has shifted its policy to make it more difficult for people to seek asylum in the United States. Critics have called this a violation of international law. Could you explain, and maybe some of the other panelists could explain, how seeking asylum in the US has changed under the Trump administration?
Sure. Partially this really goes back to the Obama administration in 2014, when you saw a wave of unaccompanied minors, or minors and their adult parents getting from Central America to the border, claiming asylum or saying they have credible fear of persecution. And this became a wave, right? Tens of thousands, which caused a crisis in 2014 and caused the Obama administration to create these family detention centers. Back then, there were only about 100 beds for families, is my understanding. And under the Obama administration, they created these family detention centers with chain link fences, and they're now called cages, but they're not cages, they're chain link fences to separate adults and children. But basically the asylum abuse, a massive abuse, because many of the asylum claims, although they passed, high percent passed the credible fear test to claim asylum, saying that they were afraid to go back to their country due to their persecution by their government or a criminal gang or domestic abuse. And this was accepted under the Obama administration sometimes. But then in the final asylum cases, many cases were not approved. So basically you had just a flood, an increasing flood of people coming in with minors. And so the whole demographic of illegal immigration or immigration between the ports of entry asking for asylum, knowing that because of the Flores settlement agreement, families could not be detained more than 20 days, beginning in 2015. There's a 20-day cap. So basically people knew that, and the smugglers and traffickers knew that, and it was the time to come into the US. So instead of things getting better under President Trump in that respect, in terms of asylum abuse, things got a lot worse. We had hundreds of thousands coming in, as you know, last year, up until the time certain administrative measures were taken, including the migrant protection protocols, and really threatening Mexico with tariffs. And Mexico finally working with the administration to agree to hold people in Mexico. And there have been as many as 60,000 waiting for asylum case hearings. So the administration since then, since the last year, has taken a lot of action in tightening what is credible fear, what does qualify, because there's a big gap between those who pass the initial claim and those who really have a valid case decided in their favor. So that, in a nutshell, is where we are. Congress has not acted to close some of these loopholes. There's bipartisan legislation by two Texans, Senator John Cornyn, Republican, and Congressman Henry Cuellar, Democrat, which would close a particular loophole, which is in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and to stop the disparate treatment of minors from non-contiguous countries and contiguous countries. But again, Congress has not closed that loophole yet. But the pandemic has, in effect, as one of my colleagues pointed out, shut down asylum.
I want to come back to some of that, but let's get our fact check in first from Chris. Chris, are you there?
I'm here and I'm working on it. This is not an easy one when you look at international policies and comparisons. So
okay, I'll come back to you on that while we're checking. Well, let's pick up from Ken's point. Ken, I'll just be, I want to follow up because, as you say, why wouldn't we want to take everyone that claims asylum? I remember a statue that a pretty famous statue in America that has that famous poem that says, "Give us your huddled masses yearning to be free." Should we go chisel that off and say we didn't mean it? Or is there a reason why we want to all of a sudden put the test for asylum so high that most people don't make it?
We want to provide asylum to those who really need it, who are persecuted by their governments for their, who cannot be protected by their governments. That was basically the initial purpose of asylum. We also want to help people in their home countries and help the countries themselves and their neighboring countries to work with us in resettling refugees and people, so they don't have to make that very dangerous journey 1,000 miles to the U.S. border. But what
if someone isn't being persecuted by their government, but by organized crime or gangs, as they're sometimes called? Because you mentioned that the administration is worried about gangs. I think we're all aware that that's a real issue in many places in our hemisphere, including our own country. So if people are trying to flee that kind of violence, especially with their children, which is usually the asylum case, is that something we want to make particularly difficult?
That's been, the administration's been tightening that particular, because that's only recently was loosened up during the Obama years. And the administration has said criminal activity, we're all subject to, in certain areas to criminal activity in our own country. And you can, certainly that was not an original intent of the asylum system to provide protection from having to suffer through crime or a government that cannot control these gangs. And we have that in our own country.
Mona, the Congress, it's come up several times now. Congress hasn't done its job of getting legislation through that administration would sign, even sometimes when both parties have had control of both the House, the Senate, and the executive. So the Republicans have had that and the Democrats have had that, but yet they refuse to spend time or effort to write comprehensive immigration reform, leaving what both sides say is a broken system. Why is that?
Well, I think it's partly because of the 3 points I kind of brought up. There are very powerful interests on both sides. So, the question of stemming continued illegal entry versus, attracting the workers that we need. And there are sort of competing interests around that. Questions about the legal immigration system and what kinds of things we should emphasize in terms of giving priority to immigrants. And it's a very difficult problem to thread that needle in terms of all the competing interests. I mean, the Bush administration had a very comprehensive plan. And I'm not familiar with the details exactly of why it didn't pass, but it's very complicated.
Jessica, you want to follow up on that?
Or did you want to go first, Manning? I was just going to say, I remember that. I mean, in 2007, well, we had great hopes, actually, that George W. Bush would be the one because he was from Texas and understood the immigration problem. And we were very close and had actually, they had planned to extend this special law called 245I, where people could pay a fine and then be able to regularize their status if they had close family members. And so that we were eagerly awaiting that in September of 2001. And then we all know, what happened. So Hispanic immigrants mostly would have benefited from that, but then it was off the table. And so we saw a lot of enforcement. That bill in 2007, I think one of the pieces is our employers versus labor. What I remember from that is that it got so complicated that immigrant advocates decided that it might actually be worse than doing nothing. The punitive nature of the reform, now maybe that seems naive looking back in our current situation, but I remember that's really what happened, that we started almost working against it because the fines were going to be so high, it was going to be so restrictive that we didn't think anybody was actually going to qualify, and that it was going to give employers new tools really to take advantage of immigrant workers. And so that was really difficult. I think we saw a better plan in 2013. The Gang of Eight, John McCain and other folks came up with a plan we really could get behind in 2013 that was going to require immigrants. It was going to be a 10-year path to a green card. It was going to be a $1,000 fine payable in 2 installments, that you prove that you were here for 5 years and had a clean record, kind of similar to DACA, pay that $500 fine for the first part, and then the second part would get you, and then 5 years later, do it again, make sure that your background is clean and that you still qualify. And then at the end, it was going to be a long road, but it was going to be a path where most of those 11 million folks don't have any path now. So it is highly unfortunate that it hasn't made it across the finish line. I really thought 2013 was going to be the year that we were going to really get it.
Yeah, Manuel, if you would, and also, what's the local effect of this impasse and the uncertainty that all this creates? I put one of my hats on. I have a degree in economics. Economists hate uncertainty. It's a drag on the economy. So, what's the impact of all this uncertainty and this impasse?
Yeah, I want to jump in and address some of Kim's political statements that were made there. I think the reality that the Obama administration is at fault for much of what the Trump administration is doing is just outright preposterous here. There's a political tactic that stokes fear around immigrant communities and blames them for things that are most times out of their control completely. So I think the comparison to the Obama administration HHS operations in response to the unaccompanied minors, I was there. I went and I visited those facilities. And I was most recently visiting the facilities at Matamoros, where I saw the direct impacts of the asylum process changes that created tent cities at the border because the Trump administration refused to address the realities of the circumstances facing folks. When it came to the caravan component, that was a very conveniently timed Republican tactic right before the 2018 election process. And magically, the caravans just stopped. The reality is the caravans have been going on for many years. And this was a tactic that was used again to score political points and to pander towards an audience that was welcoming this idea of a wall that Mexico never paid for. So the reality is right now, the administration sadly is using Stephen Miller's terrible, terrible tactics to demonize this immigrant community. When the reality is there's profiteering going on for the value of each immigrant that is stacked into one of these overcrowded facilities. I think it's hilarious that we use COVID for responses as to why some of the Republicans aren't doing things, when the reality is they can't even accept that it is actually true and happening. The president himself makes these claims. So, I think we got to challenge that narrative. Monsignor, when you talk about the local impact, the president's direct rhetoric and response to all these changes that Stephen Miller is proposing is stoking direct fear in our communities. As we look at engaging folks for the census right now, our communities don't want to participate at all. And this is something that's going to affect the communities for a decade. This is reapportionment. This is representation. So we've got serious issues that is directly intentionally created to disallow for the appropriate counts of this population of folks and an entire community of immigrants.
Then I'll give you a minute to to go back and forth there a little. But I want to see, Chris, do we have that fact check yet?
I will have a little something in a minute.
Okay, great. And Allison, I want to make sure I'm not leaving questions from the audience and our listeners, our wonderful listeners out. So do you have any that we need to address?
We have a lot of questions here. I'm going to try and keep it on a similar topic, but thank you to those of you submitting your questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible.
Okay, this one seems back. Let's give Ken 1 minute to respond to.
Yeah, sounds good.
And then I'll come right back to you. Okay.
Sure. My understanding, actually, under the Trump administration, deportations are lower than under the Obama similar period in the Obama administration. In fact, President Obama's administration had a record of over 400,000 deportations in 20.
Back to blaming Obama.
So yeah, the reality is that, yeah, deportations have been prioritized. Most of the deportations under President Trump have been people who have been arrested and are involved in the criminal justice system. So,
like the professor from KU who was arrested in front of his family.
The other point that
you
didn't mention, Manuel,
a little plug for Donnelly there, but go ahead.
Last point that wasn't mentioned was that the Biden plan would end all deportations for his first 100 days, would end work site enforcement, would really gut enforcement that would only incentivize even further illegal immigration and even less cooperation among federal and state and local authorities in enforcing legitimate federal immigration law.
Ken, let me, because several people have hit it, and I'm going to put it in my own language. It seems to me that for two biblical generations, for 40 years, the United States has basically put on our entries two signs: keep out and help wanted. Because no one comes here and stays here for long without employment. They can't, because they can't make access to any other way of survival. So almost everybody is employed by somebody. And your party is famously advertises itself as pro business. Obviously someone in need walking to the fence and seeing two signs, keep out, help wanted, it's going to say, well, the help wanted, that's the one that I'm going to follow. Mm-hmm. And so many would argue that people are keeping this ambiguous so that they can use labor to suppress wages nationwide. in an anti-labor move and get away. So there's a lot of criticism on that side, but yet it doesn't seem like businesses are the focus of the enforcement right now. So I'd like you to, if you don't mind.
That's correct. I mean, there is definite opposition among the business community to e-verify, to mandating that even among the states. It's very controversial because of that job magnet and the reality. I think that we definitely need to address that. I understand the president's plan on immigration is to tie immigration much more to the workforce and legitimate economic needs we have for immigration, and to just like Australia and Canada, tie their immigration much more to jobs that are where we need people. And we currently have a primarily family-focused reunification system, and the president has kept legal immigration levels.
Family separation isn't family-based.
It's been mostly family-based. The highest percentage of our immigration has been related to family members bringing other family members.
Let's go to Allison. We have a few questions from our audience.
Yes, and though these topics can bring about emotion, I want to remind our esteemed panelists tonight that if we were in person, we'd have a civility bell to try and prevent us from interrupting one another. But great thoughts here, and I do have a question to add to it. This is from a attendee. They're asking, why does it seem impossible to be both compassionate to legitimate immigrants and concurrently judicial to deal with criminal, gang, and illegitimate aliens? And I'm not sure where that should go. I think it could really fall to any panelist.
Yeah, Jessica, you deal with some of the legal issues. So do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really not, if we could just do some common sense, solutions. And I'm remembering sort of a thing I had wanted to say on the criminal gang situation, and then I'll return to that topic, is that under asylum law, you can request asylum if your government is persecuting you, or if you're being persecuted by a group which your government cannot control. And so it's not that anybody can come that's a crime victim and apply for asylum, but that folks have to prove that the government is unable to assist them to be safe. And so that's the nuance there, I guess, with the asylum law. I wanted to address that. Yeah, I mean, I really think that all of this really isn't such a dichotomy. I mean, we're talking about skilled labor versus family. All of my clients are employed, like you said. I mean, we obviously need this labor. We have a great shortage of manual labor folks, of people who can do auto mechanics and HVAC and that kind of thing. That, I mean, I'm really pushing my own children that direction versus the $200,000 college debt I have, knowing that doesn't seem like such a good idea anymore. And also, it's just not true that some of these historic sending countries are unskilled labor. Mexicans are now the highest educated group of immigrants in the country. We're seeing these DACA students, especially, that have been here, their entire lives, and have excelled in our schools, and are, come from families where maybe their father finished the 3rd grade and they're going to college and getting master's degrees. And so I just think some of these are political games that we all play, both parties and all around, from scoring points and scaring people on either side. And if we really did see the reality of what was happening, that we could find a solution for everyone. We could do another legalization, an earned legalization for the 11 million people who are here, or remove just some of the really terrible impediments that were put into the law, like especially in 1996 under the Clinton administration. The IRA really made it very difficult. My own family suffered from this, that my husband had come to the US without a visa, as many as 40% of our folks do, our undocumented population. And so even with a US citizen wife and 2 US citizen children, he still had to go back to Mexico and stay there for a whole year waiting for our paperwork to be approved. I mean, and so is that right? I mean, with, this is pushing families to public assistance, like our immigration system, ripping the breadwinners out of the home. So I think, we need to focus on common sense solutions. And we had that several times, specifically in 2013, I'll look back to that, where they would not allow it to come down to a vote, the Republican leadership, because they knew that their people would vote for it. Because like we said, business leaders are part of the coalition for reform. They want workers. We need people to clean the hotels and be nurses and skilled labor as well. And so that was a high disappointment. And I'm really hoping in this next new Congress, we will see bipartisan agreement to push forward.
Yeah, well, there's a great, let's use that right now. Let's use the 2013 bill. Why can't we do things in the middle anymore? Why can't we find compromise? Mona, you're a political scientist. You teach this. What is it about our current reality that has kept us as a nation from being able to do big things and find that middle ground that historically was the pragmatic solution to many of our problems?
Well, that's a big question, but I think, there's the increasing polarization of our parties, the primary system that tends to reward, extremist candidates.
Gerrymandering is one of the answers. That's one of the problems.
Oh, sure. That's another problem. I don't know if that's so much a driver of the polarization, but it's definitely it's a different kind of problem with sort of representation. The increasing polarization of the two parties and the sort of, I wanted to respond just a little bit to some of Jessica's points. I think it is, when we look at these things from the perspective of an individual or from the perspective of, what would make sense to me, I think it can look like it's sort of obvious what to do. But, and she mentioned this too, and she knows, she's been involved. When you get the various interest groups involved and the politicians trying to serve different interest groups, it becomes very complicated. In terms of, what small little piece of this legislation, is going to drive them to jettison the whole thing.
Well, let's take Manuel and Ken for a minute. Let's try to find a compromise here on DACA. People have been here. People have been here.
Yeah.
Were brought here as children. They didn't have a conscious decision to violate the law or not violate the law. Grew up here, graduated from high school here, are working or going to higher education now. Why can't we find a good common sense solution that will allow those people who only know this country for all practical purposes to stay in the country and contribute to our economy, to our society, serve in armed forces, all of that?
Yeah, we used to have a tremendous consensus on border security. Senator Obama, Senator Biden, Senator Clinton, Senator Chuck Schumer, they all voted for over 600 miles of secure fencing in 2006, but Congress provided less than $2 billion for that. It was never fully completed. And now that's no longer a bipartisan issue, unfortunately, in my opinion. And President Trump has wanted to complete that, to do his mandate for better border security in exchange, I believe, for legalizing the DACA population, doing it congressionally. There's been a failure of both parties to agree on that because now the wall is anathema among the current House majority. And I would just add that conservatives also, after 1986, they saw the amnesty, the millions of undocumented people became citizens, but they did not see that enforcement. They did not see illegal immigration end. And I think once we see, I think among conservatives, once we do see this tremendous progress in reducing illegal immigration, there'll be much more appetite among conservatives, as we've seen, to legalize the DACA population and go beyond that.
Yeah, just to respond quickly, the wall is most certainly political football, right? It's outright ridiculous that we only focus on the southwestern border, to be quite honest. We cannot build a wall around our entire country. Walls have not worked for millennia at this point. And a ladder and a shovel have clearly proven that a wall is not a valuable use of our resources federally. So when it comes to that, this idea of jumping back to, well, let's build the wall first. No, let's fix our immigration system to legally immigrate here and make sure that they have the resources they need to process actual visa applications. Let's start there to allow the legal pathway to do its course. When it comes to DACA, as you said, Monsignor, absolutely. Let's put it to a vote right now and see what happens. I'm most certainly willing to advocate to my members of Congress and senators, but I think that there's not interest there because, as Jessica had mentioned, it will pass and it will be sent to the president's desk, and that doesn't support his base or his efforts of anti-immigration efforts.
Allison, I'm going to go back to you because Shidi had some other questions.
Yeah, Monsignor, thank you. One topic that has come up quite a few times in the Q&A feature is calling to attention healthcare of detainees or undocumented folks. So I'm going to try and do my best to combine all of the different questions. So recently, the ethics and adequacy of healthcare being provided to detainees has been called into question. How can we be convinced that detainees are being treated humanely when current administration is simultaneously seeking ways to further restrict healthcare access to not only undocumented folks, but to Americans in general? A lot to unpack there. My apologies, just an effort to try and address multiple questions at once.
Yep. Who wants to weigh in first on that?
Yeah, I mean, I've been to the facilities beforehand. Obviously, COVID is a new beast for everyone to try and address. But the reality is when the administration sues to not provide toothbrushes, I find it very hard to understand that they're going to provide a valid program to respond to COVID, right? We have a system right now set up for our federal prisons where we're allowing relief for folks. I don't understand why we haven't implemented this simultaneously within these facilities, right? The only advantageous thing is if you release an immigrant from a facility, you don't fund them anymore for the privatization of holding them in those facilities. So there's a serious issue, and the overcrowding of these facilities already are just petri traps that are bound to explode. So sadly, this is a failure of our government.
Mona, do you want to put that in historical perspective? What have we done in the past?
What have we done in terms of healthcare for immigrants?
Yeah, health, and especially healthcare. When you detain someone, they're not convicted of anything. You're detaining them, holding them for hearings. So obviously, it should be a difference between that and a punitive situation.
Incarceration, so, yeah. Well, in fact, until fairly recently, what is often pejoratively called catch and release, immigrants weren't held in the same way. They were given a court date or a hearing date, and they were released into the community. And the statistics I've seen suggest that, upwards of 90 some odd % show up for those hearings. So, it wasn't exactly the same kind of problem previously until largely under the Trump administration, detention became the primary tool for rather than, setting a court date and allowing these people to stay.
Ken, do you want to weigh in on just that point? Because a lot of people do criticize, you've heard Stephen Miller's name brought up, and we know that he was behind making it difficult, making it more punitive, trying to deter.
Right.
So go ahead.
And the reality is most illegal immigrants, people detained for entering the country illegally, are held in private detention contracted facilities by the federal government. In fact, presidential candidate Joe Biden's platform commits to ending private detention, which would basically end a tremendous amount of the detention capacity that the US government has, because most of it is private. But remember that many people that are detained get their first immunizations. Many of these young people get their first immunizations at these facilities, see their first doctors. Certainly the COVID has thrown a wrench into this. And it deserves investigation, as I understand is happening now.
Yeah, there's some lawsuits being filed because of inadequate care or even some forced care in areas which we won't talk about because it gets into medical ethics. But there's some real problems there. Why should we have private people? Why shouldn't we just let people go to their relatives and then show up for their court date? They haven't been convicted of anything.
Well, there has been a problem, especially with the waves of asylum claimants who have not shown up. Many have not shown up to hearings, and it really has been driving detention, as Mona indicated, has been a way to deter more families from coming up. It really is a deterrent to try to stop the waves. We have unprecedented numbers as recently as May of 2019 of over 100,000 in 1 month. And our federal officials and local officials in Texas were absolutely overwhelmed. And currently in the country, we have hundreds of thousands of people who came in essentially as refugees who are here now because of that catch and release policy.
Chris, do you want to comment on your fact check?
Okay, yeah, I posted the answer to the first fact check about priority of immigration for family reunification versus need to work. I looked at Canada, for example, posted an answer. There's a strong sentiment in Canada that family reunification takes priority. However, they're both very intertwined and very important, but you have to go country by country to kind of unwind this. There's also a fact check, and it wound up in the answered pile, but I don't think I answered it. And they wanted to check, where was it? Now it's gone. Refugee caravans. I'd like a check on the statement that refugee caravans have been happening for many years. What I did find quickly is that advocacy groups have organized caravans to help fleeing people from Central America, and in the process highlight the dangers. A group called Pueblo Sin Fronteras, I apologize for my pronunciation, has been organizing caravans since 2008 and was behind the group that caught the attention of Trump and other Republicans in March. There's an article in the Atlantic magazine about that in 2018.
Thank you, Chris. Allison, questions from the audience?
Absolutely, they're keeping me busy over here. There's a question about green cards. An attendee would like the panel to address country limits on green cards and the possible effort to reallocate the countries with the most demand. They give the example of the H-1B documents that possibly those from India will have to wait over a half a century or more for a green card status, while other countries will never use their slots or allotments.
Okay, does someone want to weigh in on that?
I mean, this is part of the inherent structural racism of our system, honestly, because we see it both in employment-based and in family-based cases where certain countries send more immigrants. So even if we wanted these professionals from India, like the question states, there's a cap because they send more than, let's say, well, Chile has its own its own procedures, but than other countries. And so, yes, I mean, these are very serious issues that could be addressed in a comprehensive reform, where we could ditch this antiquated system that was built in 1950, because we do see people who are eligible and willing and wanting to be here and are contributing to America, and yet we have the system that doesn't work for them or their employer. On the family side, we see this as the get in line, and where it most affects Mexico, China, and the Philippines, where, let's say I'm from Honduras and I want to bring my brother here. It may take 10 years, which is a really long time, but it's still the short line. If I'm from Mexico, it would take double that. It would take 20 years to get in the line. And Philippines is often even longer than that. And so because of these per country caps, that's where we really see a lot of the inequality in the structural basis of our system. Thank
you. Well, it brings up the question. I mean, 20 years, which is what it is. It's more than 20 years for someone from the Philippines. So if I'm a high-tech worker working in Silicon Valley, and my parents are here and I'm here, all immigrants legally, and they're getting older, and I need to bring my sister here to help take care of my older parents while I work a high-tech job in Silicon Valley. The wait time is more than 20 years. Obviously, no family waits 20 years to be reunited. So there's lots of pressures just to ignore what is obviously an unjust law. In my tradition, the Catholic tradition, there's a right to immigrate, right? We recognize it, that, it's a fundamental right, like a property right, but it seems like that is controversial. I'm surprised. I mean, that's one of the basic human rights most people would say. So where do we stay? Ken, do you think, does the Republican Party believe there's a right to immigrate?
The Republican platform celebrates immigration, obviously you can see it in the wording, but at the same time, it's a prudential judgment for each country to determine how many people can we receive, and putting our citizens and lawful residents first. It's a very legitimate thing, I believe, in the tradition as well, to recognize that the country does have to look out first for its own interest to maintain itself as a country, in this case, the United States, as a country that is attractive and able to maintain the rule of law and an orderly immigration system. We're still the most generous country in the world in terms of receiving immigrants and refugees, even under President Trump.
Manuel.
I think I disagree with that last statement wholeheartedly with all that is me. But the reality is, it is a fundamental right, right? Going back to my Christian faith as well, you welcome thy strangers. So the reality here is, we can't plaster welcoming our tempest toss and the harbors that yield into our country that we celebrate every 4th of July, claim to be a Christian-based country, and then turn our backs on immigrants, or only welcome them when we want them to pick our fruit or clean our rooms. So the reality is here, we need more humanity in the system. I'll acknowledge from the Democratic Party standpoint, it seems like we need to do less compromising at this point and take a stronger stand for all the people and all their needs. Because at this point, compromise has got us into a place where we're pigeonholed and stabbed in the back constantly, and we're not actually producing the real needs of the people that are going to benefit from these programs. So that's where I fall on that one.
Mona, just talking about the economic impact of immigration, is it a net positive or a net negative for the United States to have a large influx of new workers, new citizens, new potential citizens?
Yeah, if I could just respond to your previous question really quickly. I actually don't think there's any country in the world, although I might agree in principle about a right to immigration, there's no country in the world that recognizes such a right. But in terms of the economic impact, most of the research I have seen suggests that the economic impact is positive. One of the claims that you often hear is that immigrants hurt low-skilled folks, in the sense that particularly with undocumented folks, they're often of lower skill, and that by having large numbers of them come in, it depresses the wages of lower skilled workers, native workers. But at least the research that I've seen suggests that that's not true, that the impact is sort of, there's no impact or a positive impact, even on low-income workers. And for the economy as a whole, I think the research is pretty definitive that immigration leads to higher economic growth.
Thank you. Let's go back to Allison for another question from the audience.
Thank you, Monsignor. Yes, I have another one. It's specifically asking from the Trump administration's perspective, but I'm going to expand the question to be about the Republican Party in general, because I know that this happens in Congress as well. So what specifically is the Republican Party advocating and or doing to help other countries remedy the problems that spur the need for citizens to seek asylum here?
Yeah, the Trump administration has been working with the countries in Central America, and certainly there was the president, as he has often done, he initially withheld aid and then has restored some aid. So there are active agreements, asylum cooperation agreements with the Northern Triangle countries. Some of the people at the Department of Homeland Security say they're getting more cooperation from Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries on dealing with immigration than with the Congress. So there has been cooperation. The US has so much leverage to work with our neighbors on this issue. And President Trump, because he threatened those tariffs with Mexico, actually got cooperation with Mexico on reinforcing their southern border as well.
Can I respond to that? Okay, great. Yeah, I don't think we should be proud to be cooperating with some of these folks who are in charge in Central America. This mess, especially in Honduras, was created, it's a criticism that a lot of us had of the Obama administration and of Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State, that we acknowledged the overthrow of the democratically elected president in 2009 in Honduras. President Zelaya was pushed out, and the current president of Honduras, his brother has been extradited here as the narco trafficker. And so I really don't think we should be proud of that they're cooperating now with our bully tactics. The real solution to immigration is to quit meddling in these other countries and to promote economic development there. Right now, Hondurans are coming not because they're poor and not because of gangs, but because of political repression. That president that is grasping for power has been, the folks have been marching in the streets and they've been violently oppressing their folks. It's very similar, Monsignor, to the sanctuary movement in the 80s, actually, is I think the level and the direction that the country is going if we don't switch course, where we're going to have even more waves of folks coming, fleeing essentially civil war in their countries that we've caused. And so I think that's really why I get passionate about immigration as a social justice issue, because if we look at the sending countries, oftentimes it's our hand that has caused the mess. Similar to the waves of immigrants from Mexico previously, we had border crossers, in the 80s, but once NAFTA took effect in 1994 and multinational corporations started pushing people off their land, that's when we saw the huge spike in Mexican undocumented immigration. And so now that's what we're seeing from Central America.
We haven't talked about immigration to a large extent from countries that are more controversial. For example, in the early part of the Trump administration, there were some specifically targeted anti-immigration movements that were by some courts and some people, and there's a reasonable argument, they were targeting people of a particular faith, in this case, Islam. Should immigration be limited based on someone's faith? Ken.
Basically the concern was not the faith, but a national security issue in terms of vetting people in countries which have a lot of terrorism activity. This was recognized under the Obama administration. Many of these countries that were identified where there was a ban on travel based on a record of problematic terrorism activity where it's difficult to vet people coming in. So it's not based on faith, but based on a violent terrorist commitments and activity.
Manuel.
Yeah, I think the immigration process, and I'm sure Jessica can attest to the vetting process that immigrants are that undergo now, is one of the most strenuous processes I've seen ever for anything, any type of application process. And so the reality that we can't figure out who may or may not be a terrorist by the processes and procedures set through USCIS is just ridiculous. So this was, again, a political tactic, a fear tactic, focused on a religious-based, systematic racism, structurally racist system perpetuated by this president. So no, we should absolutely not be discriminating on anyone for the country they come from, the needs they may have, the religion that they celebrate. Absolutely not.
Yeah, or at least it should be consistent. I mean, there were lots of countries who have legitimately sent terrorists to our country who, again, were left out. But I mean, I do not support the ban in any way, but I just think it's hard to say with a straight face that it really was about terrorism when the countries that actually have sent terrorists were not included.
Allison, I only have a few minutes before we have to go to our concluding questions, but I want to make sure I got all the audience questions that we can.
We're not going to get all of them, but I do have a good one to end on. It's going to take us a different direction, something we touched on earlier. What efforts have been made to address the judicial hearings backlog for immigration hearings? It seems like increasing the rate of judicial hearings would address the issue of holding a lot of people without hearings.
Mona, can you weigh in first on that, please?
Yes. Up until fairly recently, the resources that have been put into trying to deal with the undocumented problem, some of it has gone to the court system. But since COVID, in fact, immigration, and this is very recent, so doesn't really speak to kind of historical patterns, but the immigration courts have been shut down. That's what I read anyway. Jessica could probably fact check me on that, but that's my understanding.
Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, the federal government altogether, both the USCIS, where people are interviewed for green cards, and the immigration courts did shut down in March. Up until recently, a lot of courts are reopening under the strong protest of the judges union and of immigration attorneys, because it's very dangerous to be doing that. A lot of these places are pack in, lots and lots of people. And so the immigration judges union is actually protesting that they are reopening in some places prematurely. But I think to get back to the solution really is that all of this detention is mostly at the discretion of ICE and at the discretion of our government. There's alternatives that cost less and are more humane. Oftentimes, folks are released first with an ankle monitor, and then once they've complied with that for a while, then they can be check in on their phones. Every day, the officers pop in on them. I mean, they're highly monitored, and I don't know if we got a fact checker, but actually there's high compliance, especially with the new asylum seekers that have been coming in with those alternative programs. And so really we are choosing as a nation, and each of us as constituents bear the blame for this current situation. And if we need to decide, are we okay with this? With private prisons, Ken brought that up, of making millions of dollars off the suffering of these immigrants when there are alternatives, or are we going to change direction and fix the issue in a more American way, in my opinion?
Thank you, Jessica. Chris, do we have any fact checks that we haven't gotten to yet?
Well, I put all the answers in the answered column here, and I know we're short on time, so I would refer people over there. There's some very good questions for fact checking there.
Well, I want to thank you, both you and Allison, of course, for your service tonight. We are getting to that point of the conversation where we ask famously in American Public Square, we like to end with, so what, now what? And so, you know, and I'm going to ask our participants all to weigh in with answers that would fit basically in Twitter if we can. I'll go to the 288 Twitter characters if we can do that. So I'm going to sort of go in the same order that I asked the original question. So Ken, you were first in the original. So I'll ask you, so what, now what?
So I think, you know, we talked about the fact that we used to have a tremendous consensus in our country among Democrats and Republicans on border security, on having a secure fencing. We have the current presidential candidate, Joe Biden, voted for that. I think the current president wants to move forward to reforming the immigration system, to making it much more tied to our economy. And that once we have a secure border, and he's making tremendous progress on that in terms of the infrastructure and the new technology, that can be done, that conservatives will be able to come to the table, will be able to say, we no longer see the problem, we've seen that it's been fixed, we want to deal with the people we now have here. And I hope that in the meantime, we all focus on simply getting people who have been convicted of serious crimes, having our local law enforcement make sure they're cooperating with federal authorities in getting people who need to get out of their communities and have been causing trouble, that they should be cooperating to get them out.
Manuel.
Yeah, just kind of quick bullet points here for me. We need to create an actual judicial system within the immigration courts, not an administrative process, because at this point, we do not actually have a traditional appointed judge ruling over these cases, and it is an administrative process. So that's something for another discussion, I think. Census compliance, obviously voting in this election and every election, stop the local coordination with KCPD and other local law enforcement agencies. These departments do not have the funds, especially now, to enforce federal immigration reform. Obviously, when it comes to the criminalistic actions, that's a little bit different, but the reality is that stripping people out of their cars in front of their children is not something that the local law enforcement should be doing. And then comprehensive immigration reform now with no compromise on folks' lives.
Thank you. Mona, so what, now what?
Well, as a political scientist, I'll say I agree with Ken that there was more kind of overlap across the two parties in the past, but we now have a very clear dividing line in terms of, as I said, I think, you know, previous administrations, you know, the philosophy was the United States needs and wants immigrants, and we need a, you know, an effective policy to make that happen. I think the Trump administration is very clear that they're largely anti-immigrant, and it's not just, you know, undocumented immigrants. And I'll just mention one thing that has hurt us at UMKC dramatically. They've made it much harder for foreign students to come to the United States. They've made it much harder for foreign students to stay after getting their degree if they want to, you know, meet all the requirements and so on. So I do think this election presents a very clear choice in terms of pro or anti-immigrant, and so people should vote and vote, you know, vote accordingly depending on what they prefer.
Jessica, so what, now what?
Yeah, we didn't come back to the DACA issue so much. I don't think Ken addressed why they should be allowed to stay, and I think that's indicative of this this administration and that policy. ICE has said that they are ready and anxious, actually, to deport DACA youth as soon as the program is ended. The president has that we won in the Supreme Court. The president is resisting complying with the Supreme Court decision and has cut the DACA program down to 1 year at a time. I think if we don't turn this ship around and we continue down this path with these folks in charge, they are extremists that are in charge, and we will see more suffering, mass deportations of immigrant youth and mass deportations of people ripped from their families. As Manny was saying, that actually happened here in Kansas City, that Kansas City, Missouri police officers helped break a window out, the glass shattered on top of an infant, and dragged a father out of his car away from his family. I mean, and that's just not, I think, what we need to be doing. I think we can do better.
Well, I want to thank all our panelists. It's a very obviously emotional and difficult issue, not only for all of you who work in this area, but for the many, many millions that it affects directly or indirectly. Donnelly College, which is the most diverse college in the entire Midwest, we deal with these questions on a daily basis. I can tell you that these affect the real lives of many, many people in the greater Kansas City area. So I personally think we need to get to real practical solutions that take people into consideration, their concrete situation. And unfortunately, all too often, I think people are used as the pawns in a bigger political discussion and political debate. So thank you for having a civil discussion. And I'll now turn it back to Claire, and I want to thank Allison and Chris for their great work.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Monsignor Swetland. Thank you also to our esteemed panelists this evening. Thanks to our fact checker and roving reporter. I have got to say, we received an enormous amount of engagement tonight from folks. So, we clearly couldn't get to everything, but really appreciate folks who've attended and the great conversation that we've had tonight with our panelists. So thank you again. A reminder that we will be sending a link with a brief survey following the program. Please do send us back your feedback and thoughts. We use that information to plan our programs, and it's really important to us when we hear from you. So we appreciate it when you respond to those. To those in the audience, thank you so much again for being with us this evening. Remember that you can access a recording of this program as well as the fact sheet and other resources at our website, americanpublicsquare.org. Also, a quick reminder, American Public Square is a member organization. We do rely on the support of our members to provide thoughtful and accessible programming for our entire community. So to those of you who are already APS members, I know there are many familiar faces on tonight. I offer our sincere appreciation on behalf of our staff and our board of directors. And to those of you who are not yet members, I hope you might consider joining today. You can learn more about membership at americanpublicsquare.org/membership. We hope you'll join for a couple of upcoming programs. We have a program called Cocktails and Politics, because we believe, especially during an election year, those two things are best when mixed together. Next, Cocktails and Politics will be September 30th. We'll be discussing jungle primaries and ranked choice voting. So for those with political interest, that'll be a night not to miss. And also on October 13th, APS will be hosting our annual fundraiser, Evening at the Square, where our special guests for that evening will be founders of the Lincoln Project. So that's going to be surely a very engaging evening as well. We hope that you'll consider joining us. Website, again, is where you can find information about that. So if I haven't already said it, americanpublicsquare.org, that's where you can find all of the follow-up information to tonight's program and future programs. With that, thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. Have a great evening. We will do our best to follow up to some of these additional questions. I did want to say, because we've gotten such great engagement, we'll do our best to follow up to some of these additional questions through podcasts and newsletters following this program tonight. So again, thanks for that engagement. Good evening.